All right. Good day, everyone, and welcome back. This is CJ, and I am here today to deliver another edition of the Sirius Report with London Paul. London Paul is just one of our greatest guests. Just tremendous amount of information. You can visit the Sirius Report at theseriousreport.com. Make sure to check out the premium content that they list with daily analysis and intelligence regarding financial and geopolitical events. And you can also join his premium podcast series at theseriesreport.com. So, London Paul, welcome back, and how are you, sir?
Yeah, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Yeah, I'm well. And yourself, CJ?
I'm doing great, Paul. It's a lot of interesting events. I think 2018 is going to be, one of those years to, no different than 2017 as far as the monumental shifts that we continue to witness and occur. And we're very thankful that we have a partnership, with you, Paul, to help us understand the geopolitical events, the strategies around it. So thank you for
Well, yeah,
that.
well, likewise, it's great to be working with Rogue Money. But yeah, I think 2017 was a big year. I think 2018 will probably be an even bigger year, where for all the reasons we won't go into, which we kind of discussed last week, in a broad sense of things that may happen in 2018. But let's be careful once again, because everything's event driven. It's not driven by dates. I mean, just to give a small example, I mean, have heard from a couple of sources that say, well, we're expecting something to happen the week commencing the 15th in the US to do with all the issues of this indictments. Now, I always file that under speculation, because nothing is date driven. It's always event driven. So yes, something may happen. It may happen the week after. It may not happen for 2 months. It doesn't matter. But I often hear dates given for things, and 95% of the time, or 99% of the time, the dates come back and they don't correlate. Nothing happens, and we kind of move on. So I'm never drawn into dates. I hear a lot of things with dates, and I never discuss dates, because they come and go, and then people get fed up because they say, well, you said something would happen on this date, and then it invariably doesn't, because it isn't date driven. It is event driven. It always has been, and it will be till the cabal's gone. And then there's programs, once they're gone, to roll things out. That will be very much event driven as well, because it's global solutions required for 7 billion or more people, and you can't just change things overnight. So something may take a bit longer, it may happen a bit quicker, but there is processes to change things, and that will come about in a kind of an event driven order. But there's certainly plans to enact change. But I never get sucked in, because I get a lot of people in touch saying, well, I've heard this about dates, but I never get sucked in. But I thought I'd just throw that in, that there's rumors about something the week commencing the 15th, and probably invariably the 15th will come and go and nothing will happen. And I'm not necessarily at all expecting anything significant to happen. But what we do know is there is certainly indictments are coming at some point. There's going to be some big names on those lists, and they'll happen when they're going to happen. And there's reasons why they don't happen sort of when everyone gets impatient and wants to see them happen.
Paul, I have to be honest here. I'm one of those impatient persons.
Well, no, look, let's be honest. As much as I'm very laid back about things, and talk about things very calmly, I'm equally impatient. Yeah, we want everything to have happened yesterday, but in terms of progress, I mean, I think a lot of frustration came about because people, say 4, 5, 6 years ago, were told, oh, well, the cabal's on the verge of capitulation. It's the end game. And I remember saying to a few people privately, look, say back in 2012, 2013, at that point, we're a decade away from it. We are years away from things happening. And then, of course, Ukraine happened, and that was a big turning point where China and Russia accelerated things massively. And ironically, it was one of the biggest mistakes the cabal made. But in the process, we saw a huge acceleration really in 2017 and through partly 2016. And of course, we'll see a huge acceleration of things in 2018, these are the sort of things that I guess we will talk about in the coming weeks and months. But and one thing that kind of struck me as being very interesting, for all the Russiagate hyperbole and all the rhetoric and all the idea that that Russia and the US are these enemies, there's been some hugely interesting developments right at the start of 2018. Now, the historical context was that the Obama administration effectively banned meetings between what would be you would call the sort of senior military leaders in NATO and their Russian counterparts. And this came after Russia's annexation, as they put it, of Crimea, even though Crimea voted to join Russia and it was perfectly legitimate and democratic. And therefore, no such meeting occurred during this 3-year tenure of the predecessor. His name is Philip Breedlove, and he's what was the previous Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, and he served from around May 2013 to May 2016. Now, what's changed? Well, apparently the sort of senior military leaders of NATO and Russia are planning to meet in Azerbaijan some point in this month. Dates aren't clear at this precise time. Now, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe is now a guy called Curtis Sakaparoti, I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce it. And he's obviously meeting with his Russian counterpart, who's Valery Gerasimov. Now, he's obviously the chief of the general staff of Russia's armed forces, and this is supposed to happen in the Azerbaijan capital, Baku. Now, what's interesting is why is this happening now after this hiatus of 3 years or so? And what's also interesting is that the Trump administration is kind of beginning the new year with several of high-level engagements with Russian governments, including the meeting between obviously Moscow's top general and this NATO Supreme Allied Commander. Now, they severed ties obviously in 2013, but also there's supposed to be various Pentagon and State Department meetings coming out of this, even whilst this kind of Mueller investigation into Russia's meddling is going on, which we know is going nowhere fast and will go nowhere in the future. So this shows an apparent sort of this follows on the back of this apparent downturn in relations between the US and Russia after the Trump administration's decision to approve the transfer of the anti-tank missiles to Ukraine. Now, I said last week it was all hot air, and giving the Ukrainians US technology just isn't interoperable with Russia's technology, and therefore it was a very bad move for Kiev. Well, it kind of proves point why they suddenly both deciding after this hiatus of 3.5, 4 years of not talking to each other, and this apparent Russian outrage at this transfer of these anti-tank missiles to Ukraine, that suddenly, well, actually, we don't really care about that. Let's get together and have a discussion in Azerbaijan at some point in January. Now, Hartman, interestingly, of course, comments on this and says, well, actually, this is all part of this normal course of diplomacy, and it's really no surprise to anyone that there are many issues that we need to discuss with Russia. Well, yeah, but so what changed suddenly after 3.5, 4 years of not talking to them, or notionally at least not talking to them? And there are other meetings planned sort of January, February time, and that's to discuss Ukraine, and that's between one of Vladislav Surkov, who's one of Putin's top aides, arguably one of the top ones, sort of in the very upper bracket, and he's meeting with Kurt Volker, who's the special envoy for the US for Ukraine. Now, why are they suddenly meeting as well? What's changed in that dynamic? And also, there's going to be discussions over long-standing issues in US-Russian relations, which have been ongoing between this person called Tom Shannon. Now, he's an official at the State Department. And then you've got Sergei Ryabkov, who's Russia's deputy foreign minister. And there's going to be conversations relating to this intermediate range nuclear forces treaty, the INF, which is supposed to be all these disagreements on the surface between the US and Russia. And I think that's all nonsense. So what this tells us is this isolation campaign with Russia is now over. And we are seeing a really dramatic U-turn in early 2018. That US-Russian relations now require more bilateral engagement. And this is despite Mueller's ongoing investigation. And I've noticed how all of a sudden no one is foaming at the mouth, be it on the Republican side, and particularly not on the Democrat side, about these meetings coming up. No one's foaming at the mouth saying it's all collusion with the Russians. That's all died to death, despite the fact the Mueller investigation's ongoing. Now, Breedlove, who obviously was this former former Supreme Allied Commander in Europe from 2013 to 2016. Now, he said, he's recently come out and said, he was forbidden from having contact with the Russians, but now there's these more pros and cons when you consider whether to hold a meeting. he quotes us saying that there's zero trust and zero rapport between the two nations, but we need to have a meaningful conversation. Well, frankly, if you had zero trust and zero rapport, you wouldn't be having these conversations, not to this extent. You might feel each other out diplomatically, but you're not going to have meetings between top aides and also between NATO and Russian counterparts. It just wouldn't happen. So what's interesting is there's the sense of urgency surrounding this Russian engagement. Now, in part, it's been sold that it's at the insistence of the Kremlin, but it's simply not the case. It's very much both parties want to discuss. Now, Congress has obviously restricted Trump's ability to lift US sanctions against Russia, and of course that's a point in history. And certainly Trump doesn't want those sanctions against Russia anymore. But because of all the ongoing events and the Mueller investigation, Russiagate and everything else, they've not been able to remove that. Now, of course, Trump did approve the transfer of these US-made anti-tank missiles to Ukraine, but which Moscow was all apoplectic about, saying, well, this is not, it's a declaration of war, but it's just a game. It's part of a game that's being played between the two parties, hence why these meetings happen. Now, interestingly, of course, Europe sat in the middle between the US and Russia, clearly just geographically. And they're concerned at what's going on with US-Russian relations. But the irony is, they started 2017 worrying that somehow Trump was going to strike some strange deal with the Russians. And they've ended the year believing that the US-Russian relations are the worst they've seen in years, well, decades even. Of course, neither was the case. He wasn't going to strike some deal in the early part of 2017 with the Russian. And neither were relations ever as bad as everyone's made it out to be. Despite people foaming at the mouth in the Democrats and even in certain parts of the Trump administration. Now, where it gets also interesting is when, and we all remember Victoria Nuland and her role in Ukraine. Now, she's even been saying that, it's about time we ended this Russian isolation policy and supports this, well, what she terms a diplomatic thaw in relations between the two. Although she frames it as, well, we want to talk about Russia's ongoing military role in Ukraine. Well, there isn't any. Its INF treaty violations, well, it doesn't have any, and its active measures to undermine what she terms transatlantic democracies, well, in Europe, which is simply not true. And, all these other tensions that are driving the US and its allies to take stronger deterrent measures. So she's saying all the right things from a US sort of cabal deep state perspective, but the reality is that's not what she means. So why is she suddenly thinking, well, hang on, we have to end this kind of feud with Russia and thaw the diplomatic process out? Now, the one thing that's interesting is Scaparotti and Gerasimov have spoken already numerous times over the phone, and that demonstrate that there's a mutual interest to maintain military lines of communication. And this supports what we've said all along, probably for the best part of 2017, when we said don't ignore the rhetoric. Russia and the US are talking militarily over Syria, for example, and it wasn't this idea there was no discussions going on. Now, why this is also interesting is back in March of 2017, Moscow sent a proposal to Washington where they wanted the sort of full normalization of relations between the US and Russia. And that was not just militarily, it was diplomatically and through intelligence channels. And of course, that fell on deaf ears. And then they proposed this non-interference agreement with the US in July of 2017. But the US just ignored that and turned down the proposal. And that sort of proved that the idea of Russian election interference in the US was utter nonsense. And that's the reason why the Russians did it, just to highlight the fact that if you both say, well, we're not going to interfere with each other, and the US just ignore it, then it kind of suggests, well, the Russians aren't interfering in the US, which they are. But it also counters, well, what interference is the US through proxies doing in Russia? And we know for a fact with NGOs that's very much the case, although a lot of those have been sort of shut down and have never really got off the ground. So obviously the State Department's official line is they want this better relationship with Russia, but that Russia needs to be a constructive neighbor. And partner of this transatlantic community, i.e. NATO. And, well, Russia very much will integrate into Europe in the future. We've talked about this before. That is most certainly will happen in a sort of post-Brussels European world. Talks about respecting Ukraine's sovereignty. Well, it really, in reality, Ukraine itself needs to respect its own sovereignty and not be undertaking the things it does, not just in Donbass, but across the whole country. It's a really nasty environment and to be in there, and there's just a lot of very ugly things go on there, which we've discussed previously. And also this idea that they're not going to undermine US allies and partners. Well, that's simply not true, because US allies and partners are going to want to work with Russia going forward, hence in this new European model, and the discussions are already ongoing. But the interesting part is there's now a recognition from Washington that we need the Russians to resolve major global challenges going forward. That relates a lot to terrorism, because, as we've said, you end the war in Syria, don't end Daesh or the Islamic State or ISIS or whatever else you want to call them overnight. There are big challenges going forward to do with those sort of things. So I think initially the US and Russia, where they can advance cooperation rapidly, will be in counter-terrorism. There is a talk that the US is now seriously looking at dealing with counter-narcotics. That's going to raise some interesting eyebrows in certain parts, given we know what's happened to do with Afghanistan and opium, and obviously there's the major kind of base in Pristina, which is in Kosovo, which handles narcotics. And then there's also counter-piracy and stuff like that. So there are certain initial win-win things they can develop. So what does this all tell us? Well, clearly the world's changing rapidly. The US is now recognizing particularly that there is a need to cooperate more with Russia, that the idea of having this cold war or cold diplomatic channels is going to warm up in a very public way. And it also, I think, is a clear indication that Trump maybe now has far more control over the Senate, Congress, and the Hill, and everywhere else for that matter, than perhaps we can believe. And I think one thing that came out, I didn't watch the interview in its entirety, although it wasn't a long one, is obviously that Trump he was at Camp David, and what was very obvious is clearly he pretty much has everyone on side as far as the Republicans are concerned. Now, you look at the body language and the attitude from people within the ranks of the Republicans, and it seems to be a very different attitude. They're far more sympathetic towards Trump now. They're less alien towards what he's trying to do. And I think that's why we're now seeing this very public change in attitude towards, Russia, and all these meetings are planned. And that's something that I think will be big developments in the sort of early part of 2018. And meanwhile, the Mueller investigation will roll on, and frankly, who cares, because it's irrelevant and it makes lots of great headlines, but it's going nowhere. And in fact, it's blowing up in the cabal's face practically on a week by week basis now, for all the things that we've discussed before, and I've discussed at some length in podcasts, which obviously our subscribers listen to, and I think that is a big turning point why we've seen this. But it is a big development, and on face value, a lot of people go, well, so what, who cares, it's not really telling us anything. But for me, it's a big sea change in attitude towards Russia, and I think it's partly as well because this whole Russiagate thing is just going to fizzle out and die a death, and it's also starting to blow up spectacularly in people's faces, and clearly we're now seeing how there's huge cracks developing in the FBI and the Department of Justice, and eventually the whole thing will just fall apart, and it will open up a whole new, multiple cans of worms in the process. So it might encouragingly suggest whether people like Trump or not, and it's very much like Marmite, as I refer to. People either love him or loathe him and don't like him, but that's not the point. The point is probably it's taken 6 months or maybe even longer for the Trump administration to regain some measure of control over internally within the party, but also within Congress and the Senate. And I think we're starting to see indications, it's not definite, but certainly indications that balance is readdressed and the Trump administration might finally be back in governance. But that's partly as well because of all these indictments and everything else that are hanging over people. There's a lot of people gone very quiet. A lot of people have saying nothing. And some people have literally kind of disappeared, not literally off the face of the earth, but they're just being very low key, because there's a lot of people, and we've said this before, very nervous inside the Senate and Congress and nervous government institutions, because they know something's coming down the track at some point, and it's going to be very widespread. It's going to be very damning. And, the aftershocks are going to be huge, and who knows who will ultimately be involved in that whole process. But it's bound to make people in those departments quite nervous of what the prospects are going to be in the future.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And Paul, there's a lot of discussion in regards to potentially the middle of January, we're going to see the official launch of the yuan denominated oil contract with the petro-yuan. Could you shed some light on that and your thoughts, please?
Yeah, I'm of course, we've talked about this before, and I've mentioned it several years ago that it would come at some point, and other people have. V mentioned, Rogue Money's done it. Jim Willie's talked about it, and several other people, not a huge amount of people, but yes, it's very much a reality now. As much as I'm very enthused by it, because it is, it's definitely a sort of an attack in inverted commas on the petrodollar. I think we need to also temper it with a bit of caution, because there seems to be the idea, well, come the 18th of January, when they launch it, that's the day this financial reset's going to happen. Well, no, it's not. And there are various reasons why that will not happen. First of all, just because the petro-yuan gets launched doesn't mean we're going to have global adoption on day 1 or even day 10 or even day 20 or 30. It's going to be a slow process, but certainly we already know that effectively Russia, China are trading in non-dollar terms for energy. We know that that's going to certainly be the case between, say, China and Iran and other nations. The big one is obviously Saudi and China, although to some extent they already are trading on some level in terms of the petro-yuan. But no, you're not going to get this global adoption on day 1. And in fact, the reset, the big, much vaunted financial reset's not dependent on the instant adoption of the petro-yuan, or in fact on the petro-yuan at all. It's not a prerequisite. The reset is dependent on that. It's an important step in the whole process, but it isn't actually, because as we've said, what the reset's about is it's the end of fiat currency. It's the death of the Ponzi financial scheme, and it's the birth of sound money. So replacing the petrodollar with the petro-yuan is fine. It's an important step in weakening the dollar, which is an important process and needs to happen. But it's not going to be this instantaneous change on the 18th and suddenly the whole world flips, because that's not how it's going to work, certainly not from my perspective. But it is an important milestone, and it will certainly be a trigger for a whole bunch of other events, and where you'll see less and less adoption of the dollar. And at some point Saudi are going to come out and say, we're no longer trading in the petrodollar, we're trading in the petro-yuan. Now that will have a lot of catalytic effects in the process. So it is an important milestone, but it's not suddenly going to be, oh, the reset happens. We're back to this point, we discussed it last week. Is the reset going to happen in 2018? Well, it might do, it might not do. There's a whole bunch of things that have to happen before that becomes a reality. And people often say to me, well, when's it going to happen? And the honest truth is, I don't know, and nobody really knows. So it doesn't mean it won't happen this year, and maybe the petro-yuan will prove to be a big catalyst in that regard, but there's no interdependency on the two of that. Sorry, excuse me. So I'm not trying to sort of pour water on this particular thing, because it is a huge event. It's very important, and it's a big step in the right direction. But I don't equally want people to imagine that that's the catalyst for the reset to happen, because it isn't, and it won't be. The reset could happen months later. It may happen next year. I don't know. I mean, I can't say. I mean, it's possible. Yeah, it could happen in 2018, and the petro-yuan certainly is a massive, important step in the de-dollarization process, and that's really largely, if you want to kill the cabal, you have to kill the dollar. Because when you kill the dollar, and if they can have every Federal Reserve note on the planet. They can own trillions of them. But when the reset happens, those trillions of dollars are worth nothing. What are they going to spend them on? Nothing. No one's going to take them. And that's the whole process. But there is a whole string of events and things that have to happen before we get to that point. So it's not a question of one follows the other, automatically and in a very short space of time. So, I mean, I'm not expecting the reset to happen, within weeks after the petro-yuan launch, but certainly it'll be interesting to see how rapidly nations do adopt it, and we do get somewhere approaching, a more global adoption of the petro-yuan. Because at the moment, in relative terms, it is quite small, but it's growing rapidly. But also, just as a very small example, and it's no sort of earth-shattering piece of news, but the central banks of China and Thailand are renewing a currency swap agreement. So basically, the People's Bank of China and the Bank of Thailand can swap. It converts to about 11 billion US dollars. I think it's 70 billion yuan. So what that'll do is facilitate bilateral trade exchanges and investments while contributing to the growth of both economies. And these agreements typically valid for 3 years, and they can be extended by mutual consent, and they will be extended 3 years from now. Now, for anyone who's not sure, because we do make statements and sometimes we get new people, a currency swap basically allows two institutions to exchange payments in one currency for the equivalent amounts in the other. Obviously, that's great for facilitating bilateral trade settlement, and it provides liquidity to support financial markets. So that's another example of de-dollarization, and the Chinese and the Thais have renewed that. You'll see a lot more of these currency swaps happening between China and other nations. So this is another small aspect of the whole de-dollarization process. And that's very much how things will work, because the other thing is you want as many nations already starting to adopt the new financial platform as far as is possible before you actually pull the plug. It makes the whole transition phase a lot smoother. And that's why you're seeing this rapid acceleration, which is always a good indication. If we see huge acceleration in terms of the petro-yuan and see massive acceleration for currency swaps and de-dollarization in a very overt way, similar to what the Chinese and the Pakistanis did recently, that is a good indication that the resets is happening in inverted commas sooner rather than later, but without saying committing to date. So there are things we need to follow and track. And whilst the Chinese and the Thai governments and the central banks doing this seems pretty unimportant, for me it's interesting because I keep looking for these kind of signals that say, okay, there's a commitment to readopt this swap agreement, and where else are we going to see an extension of swap agreements or the adoption of swap agreements between nations and China? And that's probably a very big indication of that the resets nearer in terms of from our perspective rather than further.
Yeah, very valid. Yeah, great points. Great point. Paul, what else would you like to discuss today?
Well, I think one thing that's interesting is so we quite often always seem to get pulled back towards China, but we've talked previously about how China set up this naval base in Djibouti, which is in the Horn of Africa in 2016. Now, what do we see now is that Beijing plans to build a second offshore naval base. Now, this is near the very strategically important Pakistani port Gwadar, and that obviously follows the opening of the first facility in Djibouti. Now, the new naval base, which is going to be near Gwadar, is obviously on the Arabian Sea, and it will be used to dock and maintain naval vessels and also provide logistical support services. Now, China needs to set up another base in Gwadar for military purposes because Gwadar is a civilian port. Now, obviously, it's common practice to have separate facilities for warships and merchant vessels because they have different operations. Merchant ships need a bigger port with lots of space because they have warehouses and containers, because that's how shipping ports work, where warships need this range of maintenance and logistical support services. So you can't integrate the two bases into one. Now, this confirmation kind of follows meetings. There's been meetings in recent months between very high-ranking Chinese and Pakistani military officers, and which kind of indicated a few months ago that they build this military base on the Jiwani Peninsula near Gwadar. And interestingly, this is very close to the Iranian border. Now, is that just a coincidence? Well, it might be, but I actually suspect it very much is not a coincidence. And that may be used to support Iran in some capacity going forward as well. I wouldn't be remotely surprised if that was the case. Now, as well as the naval base, there's going to be an expansion of the existing airport on the peninsula. They're going to put a security buffer zone in, and they're going to, have a relocation of residents in a very sympathetic way from that area. So this is going to be the Chinese taking this whole peninsula over. Now, what's important, we've talked about this, but it's worth reiterating, that Gwadar is a key part of this China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is the CPEC. And it's to link China through trade and infrastructure to Africa, Europe, and beyond. So from a maritime perspective, it's huge. And this corridor is going to be this multi-billion dollar set of infrastructure projects that link China and Pakistan. And there's going to be all the road and rail links. So Gwadar's got this great geostrategic and military importance to China. But we have to emphasize China is not going to militarize Pakistan and take it over. That's not the purpose of it. The purpose is these bases have been put in to future-proof for the different world and how it will be in the future, when there will still be challenges globally to deal with problems. But of course, there'll be a global response to it. But I mean, already China's invested in Gwadar around $70 billion equivalent. So it's not chicken feed by any stretch of the imagination. So why does China want to be in this part of the world? Well, it's pretty obvious. There's better access to the Indian Ocean, because they're obviously largely limited to the Strait of Malacca, which is in Southeast Asia. So the Gwadar port will be a transit hub for obviously sea and land routes. And because they're going to open this huge rail link up, and that'll help to improve and cut the cost of logistics for China. It's great business for Pakistan in the process. And obviously, what's interesting is the timing. Again, why announce it now? We've just had China and Pakistan announcing they're going to trade, bilaterally in each other's currency. It's a big step forward. Pakistan's part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, so very much it links in militarily, economically. And these are great win-win situations for both nations. But also, there are reasons why the Chinese naval presence, why it wants to be in the Gulf of Aden and other warships, because Chinese oil tankers in the Indian Ocean need a naval base for maintenance as well as logistical supplies, and also to make sure that oil tankers don't get hijacked. Yeah, these things do happen, not very often, but there are concerns about this. And if you look at it, when you compare to Djibouti, that got built very quickly in 2016. It's a big logistical base. They've got naval troops arrived in July last year, in 2017, and they have these live drills. And what basically China's doing is saying they have the ability to protect its overseas interest in Africa and the Indian Ocean region. Now, it's no surprise they've got Djibouti, and now they've got this new naval base that will be built near Gwadar. But it's very much a statement of intent that this is how the world will be in the future. There's going to be strategic ports put in place to handle potential problems on a global basis. But China is not militarizing the world. It's not trying to adopt US hegemony. It just simply doesn't do that. Pakistan wants the Chinese to be there. It's advantageous for both nations, and its close proximity to Iran, I think, is hugely interesting. And in a way, it's an indication to not Washington and not the Trump administration, but to the cabal that, sorry, your days are over. You can go around threatening and posturing Pakistan, which we saw with trying to cut off aid to Pakistan. And what did Pakistanis immediately do? They said, fine, we don't really need your money. By the way, we're going to trade bilaterally with China in each other's currencies. Oh, by the way, we're going to open this new naval base that the Chinese are going to put in near Gwadar. And then, of course, what has happened with Pakistan and the US? Well, we'll sort of briefly discuss what you talked about earlier with these refugees, but to do with Afghanistan, but also what's Pakistan now considering doing? They're going to block supplies of US troops who are deployed in Afghanistan through its territory. That's a pretty big statement after Trump accused Islamabad of providing safe haven to terrorists. You know, and the US was saying we're going to suspend the delivery of military equipment and security aid to Pakistan because you're not taking sufficient measures in the fight against terror group. So what does Pakistan do? Go, well, we don't really care. And fine, by the way, what we'll do in the process is we're going to block your supply lines to your US troops in Afghanistan. How do you feel about that? Now, would you ever have imagined a nation like Pakistan being, in inverted commas, that overtly aggressive? And I don't use that literally in the sense, but in a diplomatic sense, being pretty aggressive with the US and laying all these ultimatums down. And the US is just having to sit there and take it. Well, would that have happened 5 years ago, 10 years ago? No. And stood up to them and said, you know, we're not tolerating this, absolutely not. And you mentioned the thing with the expulsion of 1.5 million Afghan refugees. Now, Pakistan said you've got 30 days. This was on the back of Trump's tweet. So, I mean, 1.5 million have got to leave within 30 days, but it's a plan they've been working on for a while by all accounts. But now it's just going into national acceptance because of Trump's tweet. So, and this zero tolerance towards immigration from what they say are terrorist-prone countries, which includes Afghanistan. Now, of course, this is a bit of a double whammy because Pakistan gets rid of potential terror cells, but it's going to create a major crisis for Kabul in terms of destabilizing the nation after the US has decided to up its number of troops and try and flex its muscles in the region. Now, the biggest problem is in terms of these, you know, obviously historically a lot of Afghanistanis moved into Pakistan for decades. Now, at some point, obviously, this 1.5 million are going to come back. The chances are, because Afghanistan's a very strange country in that Kabul government really only controls the capital, and apart from that, it has very little influence over a large part of the country, which is under Taliban control. So it's very likely these 1.5 million people will come back. They're going to side with the Taliban rather than Kabul, and it's going to make the country or the situation infinitely more difficult for the US to control Afghanistan. So in a way, Trump's tweet set off a chain reaction that, well, Pakistan gets rid of a major problem. There's no international outcry that says, hang on, you're deporting all these refugees. That's just not acceptable. They've had to suck on that and go, well, we can't really say anything. And in the process, it makes the situation in Afghanistan infinitely more complicated. And it's a major headache for the US. So it's kind of this double whammy. But that's what's happening now. Nations are intelligently going, okay, well, if Trump will say the following, we can use that to our advantage. Do I think Trump is actually going to be that annoyed about it? No, because ultimately, does Trump really want the US to be in Afghanistan? No, he doesn't. The US foreign policy in the long term is going to be nothing to do in how it deals with nations now. Yes, that, you know, it's all part of this game. The game has to be played, and at some point, the Trump administration had to take this harder line with Afghanistan as part of that game. But ultimately, does it want to be there? I mean, and what we do know, which is factually true, and has been proved to be the case, that the US administration has started destroying a lot of the opium farms and the opium production facilities and laboratories in Afghanistan. So there is a move to tackle this problem. And ultimately, the US will not want to be in Afghanistan and try to deal with the Taliban. And at some point, they'll make this orderly exit out of Afghanistan and let the problem be dealt with by the Afghans and also by nations in close proximity, so Pakistan, India, and people like that, or nations like that, rather than the US trying to stomp its influence, because ultimately it's just going to blow up in the Trump administration's face anyway, because there is no doubt there'll be heavy casualties. And the one thing that is never popular in any administration is when, you know, numerous people have to be flown home to be buried in the US, and it becomes a very publicly known event. You can't hide these facts. It's very difficult to hide, you know, huge death tolls in places like that. It becomes a very unpopular decision because people say, well, why the hell are we there? There's absolutely no reason. Well, we know ultimately why the US moved into Afghanistan in 2001, just look at the US economy, it was falling flat on its face, and suddenly it had this huge jolt in the space of 12 months. Well, we know it's to do with the opium production, but as far as the average American person, or European for that matter, is concerned, well, actually, we don't know this even happened, so they would see no justification for being there. So, but I think it's just another indication of how nations have, and it's increasingly happening, where what really is ultimately cabal type policy is blowing up in their face, and nations, in this case Pakistan, are using it to their advantage and actually really turning out the tables on its head and causing the cabal, the deep state, whatever you want to call it, major headaches in the process. And we'll see, I think that's one thing we'll probably see a lot more of going forward in 2018.
Paul, perhaps if Pakistan does, follow through with this, perhaps under Nikki Haley's leadership, they could call another urgent UN Security Council meeting for the humanitarian crisis.
Well, yeah, this is kind of incredulous. That, I mean, Iran. We talked about this and said it'll be hotter. There won't be any overthrow of the, and it's pretty much fizzled out fairly quickly. But yeah, there was this absurd suggestion from the US that somehow there's this horrendous crisis going on in Iran, and we need to take action because the Iranian people are protesting, and and they're suffering as a consequence. And somehow this was some veiled attempt to try and instigate more sanctions or more action taken against Tehran. But of course, the UN Security Council basically rebuffed this US's attempt to what was effectively to hijack its mandate. I mean, everyone said that the Iranians are fully implementing the nuclear agreement, and they were basically, the US was told to refrain from interfering in the internal affairs of other nations. And so it was another foreign policy blunder of extraordinary proportions. I mean, at the meeting of the UN Security Council, which was convened at the United States' request in this regard, the Iranian permanent representative said, and quite rightly said, that the discussion of his country's internal affairs was beyond the UN Security Council realm of competence and capability, and that the United States had abused its powers as a permanent member, which of course absolutely they did. Now, in terms of the anti-government protests that began sort of 27th, 28th of December, yeah, there was a number of people who were killed. I think it was probably under 100, but there were certainly people died in the unrest. And apparently there's been hundreds of rioters arrested, will be put on trial. But there's rumors also that the ex-Iranian president Mahmoud Ahmadinejad has been arrested for his role in apparently contributing to this unrest in the country. I don't think there's any actual confirmation, but there's been reports alleging that he's been detained and placed under house arrest because of allegations he supported or incited unrest in Iran. Now, there's no doubt whether he's responsible or not. There was certainly Western influence in there. There was certainly the Israelis probably were meddling in some capacity or other to destabilize the country. But the idea that you can have protests and then suddenly instigate UN Security Council resolutions is farcical. And sorry, excuse me, hang on a sec.
No, correct. Yeah, I completely
sorry about
agree.
That. What's even more farcical is if that's true, that the UN has the mandate to interfere. Well, maybe they should go and interfere in Israel, because for 6 weeks they've had protests against Netanyahu, which have had far higher significant numbers of people protesting than anything that happened in Iran. So maybe the UN could go and intervene in Israel and deal with Netanyahu in the process. I mean, that shows the sheer hypocrisy and the absolute insanity of what the US is doing in the UN. I mean, talk about desperation, it's just farcical.
Correct. Paul, what else is on your radar?
I think we don't often talk about Bitcoin, but I think there's been some interesting developments to do with the whole Bitcoin futures, which is effectively people were able to go long and short in terms of the price. Now, what's certainly happened since the beginning of December, when the CBOE and the CME started trading Bitcoin futures, the price has kind of stagnated in this kind of range, about $11,000 to $17,000 or so. Now, but what is interesting is the Bitcoin futures market volumes have been quite a bit lower than was anticipated, because everyone expected this to be this huge explosion. Now, volumes on both the CBOE and the CME are pretty small, because they're only around 50-60 million, or were, sorry, $50 to $60 million per day. It's pretty small when you think that the average Bitcoin trading volumes on the exchanges is around 15 billion per day. Even if the CBOE and the CME have risen to around 60 million, $70 million respectively. Now, that's chicken feed compared to 15 billion per day. I mean, and the combined size of the Bitcoin futures market was only $150 million, and the total value of all Bitcoins in existence is around 300 billion, give or take. So again, just chicken feed. So why are these volumes so small? Well, big banks are still not offering clients access to the Bitcoin futures markets. There's issues between the futures contract price and the underlying Bitcoin price, although that is beginning to resolve itself. But what is definitely the case is institutions are using the futures product to slowly build short positions in Bitcoin. Now, around sort of Christmas time, roughly half of open interest through these futures contracts were net short. Now, leverage funds that consist of hedge funds and money managers had a net short position of around 25% of the total interest. Now, what's clear is that hedge funds and large traders are betting that Bitcoin will fall, whereas small investors, retail investors such as you and I, remain convinced that Bitcoin prices will keep on rising. Now, in terms of Bitcoin futures, for what we deem retail investors, i.e. you and me, around 80% of positions are long. Now, in terms of large trading companies, they're not managing client money. They just trade on the basis around 70% of positions are short. But what is clear is the current position is range sort of bounding Bitcoin. Now, what's also interesting is that Bitcoin transaction costs went from around $6 per transaction up to about $60 just prior to Christmas, but they've kind of dropped down to around $30 in recent days. Now, when you look at Ethereum, there's been big rise in that reached about $150 per transaction, and then it's around $1 now. And then there's been big moves in Ripple, but their transaction charges are only a few cents. But the 1/3 share of Bitcoin of the total cryptocurrency market, of around, which is now about $790, $800 billion, is actually a new low. And in contrast, the market of about $790, $800 billion for the total cryptocurrency market represents a new high. So there's definitely a shift out of Bitcoin into currencies, which shouldn't entirely surprise people. So what's in the future? I think you may see futures contracts for the likes of Ethereum and Ripple coming down the track. Retail investors in South Korea and Japan are still very crypto buoyant. They're buying a lot. Could we see a short squeeze because of this in Bitcoin? It's possible. But what I think we're seeing is definitely the fact that even though the Bitcoin futures market's pretty small, and it is, it's definitely having an impact on Bitcoiners. Something I said that I was concerned about and wary of that could happen. I think we're certainly seeing that to be the case, which is why it's trading in this range. Now, often, from my perspective, when something trades in that range, there can be a situation where people are selling out who hold Bitcoin. It can be people short selling on these futures markets to look because they want to drive the price down. Now, do we get greater adoption in the futures market? No one can say at this stage, but certainly it's having an influence over Bitcoin. It may be partly the reason why, the amount of volume that Bitcoin is traded in the whole cryptocurrency market globally is in decline, and maybe that's why other cryptocurrencies such as Ethereum and Ripple did make significant gains very quickly, because people shift from one to the other. I still come back to the point. Ultimately, I think 2018 will see the birth of asset-backed cryptocurrencies, whether people agree with it or don't agree with me. I think the argument of decentralization of cryptocurrency, whilst on notionally it makes sense, I think the fact that a futures market so small can range bound Bitcoin, which was undoubtedly, the biggest single cryptocurrency in terms of the market. The fact they can do that shows, well, decentralization is irrelevant. It doesn't make any difference because if somebody can control the price, then for me that's a big problem. And then the other problem is okay, people can make huge profits, and I don't dispute that's possible. But imagine if someone makes millions of dollars of profit in Bitcoin. Well, when it comes to selling those, how easy is it to get your money out of an exchange? There are limitations as to how much you can take out, depending on the tier of your membership of that exchange. That is a concern to me as well. So I think it's worth mentioning that there certainly is an influence in terms of from the futures contract. I think you will see an extension to other popular currencies, because that's the one thing, when they become popular and there's big uptake, that's when the paper market effectively will move in. Now, is it going to have the same effect on these other cryptocurrencies? Possibly, we can't say. But I do have concerns, and my concerns still remain. It doesn't mean they don't have a future, and it doesn't mean that people can't invest in them and shouldn't invest in them. But from my perspective, I see the future is far more geared around asset-backed, which will have global adoption, which can be used for trading, and which will, circumvent a lot of issues to do with traditional currencies. At the moment, the volatility in cryptocurrencies just makes it, very difficult to price anything. And people said to me, "Well, for your subscription, price it in Bitcoin." I said, "Well, yeah, but I charge this one day, and Bitcoin moves 20%. What do? I have to every day keep re-averaging the price, and it could move rapidly. So someone pays double the amount than someone did in the morning. I mean, how often? I mean, yeah, because it is that volatile and can be. It just makes it impossible for me to consider using it as a payment method. Sure, you could set it up if people want to take donations. That's a different matter, because that's up to the individual what they want to donate, and then whatever you convert that into if you want to, or you want to keep as Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency is fine. But I have concerns, and those concerns remain. And I think certainly the paper market is having an influence over Bitcoin, which is why people are moving out of it and exploring other options. But there's no doubt if they think there's a repeat and rinse operation, then they will certainly look to adopt these futures contracts with other popular cryptocurrencies where they feel there's a market and they can make some money. And the difference is they're just doing it to make fiat currency. And I certainly think, despite all the rhetoric, a lot of people are just investing in cryptocurrencies for fiat profits, and that's fine. No problem with that. But certainly the paper markets is all about making fiat profit. They're not interested in holding or owning the cryptocurrency. It's just a way to make money. But they're certainly starting to influence the price, and that does concern me somewhat.
Correct. Yep. It's very interesting to watch and observe this. I mean, just not only just watching, for example, some of the exchanges that have been, so inundated that they're actually, not accepting, any new accounts, and then now also we're learning that people are actually selling their fully verified crypto exchange accounts. It's just a lot of craziness, a lot of madness, but time will tell. In fact, so Paul, also want to get your thoughts on this entire 25 number 45, this book that was written by Wolf. I can't remember his first name. That's been going around that they want to utilize this book. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, you mean the whole Trump? Oh, supposedly the big expose on Trump.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, yeah, we can't really not mention it. And look, from my perspective, it makes great headlines. I mean, I still maintain, despite all the rhetoric, that Trump and Bannon are on the same page. It was interesting to note that Bannon made these comments and regarding this meeting between the Russians and the US, and he called it treasonous and unpatriotic. And then he actually came out and said, "Look, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean, Donald Jr. I was referring to Paul Manafort." Well, that's what I understand. He said, But so he kind of backtracked a bit. He hasn't backtracked on his pretty harsh comments to do with Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner in the process. But I think what this really is all about, it'll make great headlines in the mainstream media. The book will probably sell millions, and it'll be all over, and it'll be in the news for weeks. But all it will eventually do is drive another nail into the coffin lid in the mainstream media. And that's why ultimately, Trump and Bannon and all the rest of them don't really care. It'll be today's news. It'll be high profile for a while. But ultimately, when the truth comes out and the real world unfolds, and the swamp's drain, all it's going to do is, because the mainstream media will jump all over this and use it to attack Trump, and not just Trump, but various other people in the process, it will just backfire on them. So fine, just let the book, run its course, let it sell millions, let it be all over the mainstream media. I can't say I've read the book myself. I mean, it's 400 pages or something like that. No doubt there's probably a lot of interesting stuff in there. How much of it is factually correct or otherwise, I have no way of commenting. But I think ultimately it will just be something that will up in the mainstream media's face, because they're very likely to pick on aspects that will just be deeply damaging to their credibility in the future, and they will seek to twist and distort things because they're still on the attack with Trump for a whole bunch of reasons. So, but I think Bannon's sort of climbed down regarding Donald Jr. and saying, well, actually, it wasn't anything to do with him, was kind of an interesting sideline. But I don't think Trump and Bannon are enemies. And yeah, there was some pretty heated comments made in terms of each other, but it's just all part of a gigantic game, and who knows
Right.
how much people, I mean, I just don't see it as anything of any great significance, and it remains to be seen how long people have any interest in it. Is it going to last for weeks or months? I mean, how much capital is the mainstream media going to make out of it? And the other point is, if they don't, then it might be very telling that suddenly the mainstream media is going, hang on a minute, we've got to be careful how we get sucked into this. So there's a lot of dynamics that will make this very interesting in terms of the content, how the media portrays it, how it's discussed. I mean, there's no doubt, I think there are people within the administration who are very unhappy with people like Kushner, and I think that's pretty much a given. And we've discussed this in the past. So there might be an undertone to comments or things in the book that very much reflect reality. But as I said, I've not read it, so I can't really comment on the content of it and what the validity or otherwise of whatever is said or not said in it. But I do think it will serve a purpose that ultimately, it could be very damaging to the mainstream media, and that's ultimately part of the swamp problem. We know that the mainstream media has been a big problem historically in the US, the UK, Europe, and everywhere else in the Western world. So they're more damage to their credibility, and that's one thing Russiagate's done beautifully, is damage their credibility. So the average American is now going, hang on a minute, I'm not quite sure I kind of believe the mainstream media the way I once used to. So let them nail their own coffin lid down, because they're doing a great job, and this might be another way that they will do that, and in the process, that's going to be very beneficial to what Trump's role is, which is taking the wrecking ball and destroying the deep state, the cabal, whatever you want to call them.
Absolutely, absolutely. Paul, closing thoughts, and then also please share with our listeners how can they learn more about your work, please?
Right. Well, I think the closing kind of feeling is just we need to sort of focus on all the things that which kind of suggest de-dollarization is coming forward. There's going to be more and more focus on the whole kind of indictment process, and maybe things will start to unfold in the coming weeks. But if they don't, people shouldn't be disappointed, because things are never going to happen the way everyone expects them to, and that's a good thing, because if it had, we probably would have never have got to the position we have now. So there's huge amounts of developments. It's the start of the year is always a bit slow, and then suddenly things start to kick back in. You might see more developments coming out of Russia, because of course they've only just celebrated Christmas there now, because they obviously have different calendar in that regard. But yeah, basically just we'll do as much to, I mean, obviously we don't discuss everything because I put a huge amount into the podcast each week, which covers off a lot more detail, but we share some things just to give people an indication of the kind of things that are happening. So I've got a bit of a tickly throat today.
No, that's okay. Very good. Yeah, I think it's the weather. I've had it for a few days as well.
Yeah,
so.
Well, we apparently have some invasion of Aussie flu in the UK at the moment. I don't know who bought it here, but it seems to have sort of. I don't think I've got that or anything. I was just joke aside. Yeah, so yeah, just be observant about things, and obviously follow Rogue Money and what we do at the Sirius Report to give you an indication and understanding what's happening. So yeah, in terms of the website, you mentioned it earlier, it's thesiriusreport.com. We have the Twitter page at the Sirius Report, the Facebook group, the Sirius Report, and of course, yes, we have the podcast, which is $4.75 a month. We do 5 podcasts a week, which is very condensed information, which is about 10 to 15 minutes, which is audio. We don't do written podcasts, and we cover off all manner of things that we think are relevant. Sometimes it's very hard to keep up with everything that's going on, but we try to cover off as much as possible and what are important. And sometimes we do discuss things that subsequently, or we make comments that subsequently things will happen, or we comment on things that are happening which have huge relevance that perhaps most people wouldn't be aware of were even relevant. And we thank all the subscribers. So you can just go to the website and find the subscription option, and it's very easy to subscribe. And you know, we do that. We had a commitment. We had a week off at Christmas, but basically we did a whole year of podcasts, and we've done 321 of them now. So we had 1 or 2 people who actually went back and listened to every one, which is quite some undertaking. But you know, I'm not suggesting to everyone.
That's great.
Yeah. I mean, because
right, it's like going back and catching up with a series on Netflix or something, right? It's that great.
Well, hopefully they thought that by the end of it, or they weren't just fed up with it. But no, and we thank everyone who's subscribed. And yes, we'd like, you know, people to continue to subscribe because, you know, it allows us to grow what we're doing. There is only the 2 of us, Lisa and I, who manage the process. It's a huge amount of work for us to do, and on a week by week basis. So, but you know, it's something that, you know, a lot of people seem to enjoy, and we just like, you know, if more people want to subscribe, then, you know, we appreciate that. But thanks for all the support Rogue Money's given us in the 12 months we've been on, because I think they've made a huge difference in terms of our audience. And, you know, we went on the X22, and I'm doing an interview, recording one with them next week, which will go out at some point. There was a bit of a delay from my side to be able to do that, but we're looking forward to doing that. And it's certainly grown our, you know, the amount of people who are aware of what we're doing. So, you know, we thank Rogue Money immensely for all that, you know, exposure and getting us on each week. So it's worked extremely well for us, and we appreciate that greatly.
Very good. The honor is ours. So, Rogue fan, thank you so much for listening in to London Paul delivering another great Sirius Report. Catch him next week. We will be back next week, and thank you all for listening in. This is CJ and London Paul, and we're over and out. Take care, everyone.